Today's talk, Anton will talk about this film trilogy that he has been developed for the past 6 years or so. It's surrounded with the idea of Russian Cosmism. Since this is the first time that this concept is introduced in Hong Kong, and we feel that it will be starting in a fluid and more casual way than through the conversation, and to elaborate how this philosophy, this concept begins and how they turn into these 3 chapters of the film. And I think there is no one better than Hu Fang today to join us for this conversation, because Hu Fang and Anton has been working a lot through the past years, and a lot of discussions surround these ideas. So I think I will just begin with very basic questions to start with. So Anton, what exactly is Russian Cosmism? How did you discover this idea, and why you decided to turn it into an art piece?
Throughout sort of extended Russian Empire, and quite oftentimes he would lose his job because he was very compassionate. So if there was like a poor student in a class, he would kind of, I don't know, donate his salary to the family of the student, which did not like sit well with other teachers, with the director of the school. It violated a lot of kind of hierarchical notions of late sort of society of the Russian Empire. So very often he would actually end up losing his job and moving to another city because of kind of this radical ethical approach to almost like a kind of an activist position of helping to somebody in need, like by any means possible, yeah? And eventually he ends up in Moscow and gets a job at the, maybe like one of the best libraries, or the most comprehensive libraries that existed in Russia at the time, which was basically a private book collection of Prince Rumyantsev, who was kind of a very well-educated, rich, enlightened aristocrat, that left his private personal book collection to the state and to be opened as one of the first like public libraries. And the collection was not that huge. I mean, it was about 25,000 books, but by that, by the standards of 19th century, that was an enormous, enormous library. And so Fedorov basically worked there until the end of his life. He never taught, he never published, partly because of this kind of modesty, maybe. He did not want to presume the position of this kind of authority, but also a lot of his writing, even though it's quite religious in a way, like he kind of, God is mentioned in every paragraph, but essentially his ideas were completely heretical and completely contradicted the central sort of Christian dogmas, which is that basically eternal life, resurrection, is something to be given to humans by God, you know, by Jesus, so that basically at the end of the world there is the last judgment, and Christ decides who is worthy of eternal life and who is a sinner and basically ends up in hell in a very bad situation. Yeah, so Fedorov completely sort of undercuts it and says that, you know, that basically everybody has to be resurrected. It doesn't matter if you're a sinner or a virtuous person. It doesn't matter if you're good or bad, but basically it's a kind of encyclopedic project that everybody is to be given this, like, yeah, opportunity to exist in the conditions of immortality. But there were also a lot of other kind of strange conflicts with dogmas, with religious dogmas of, let's say, Russian Orthodox Christianity. So he never published, also because he was afraid that if this ideas kind of gained circulation and prominence, he would be immediately excommunicated from the church, which for him would have been a personal tragedy, because even though he had this kind of really extraordinary, very radical ideas, he was also a deeply, deeply devout kind of religious person that actually went to church and observed all of the, you know, rituals and all of that. So he didn't want to risk that. But for example, one of his kind of most, let's say, influential students in a way was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Maybe some of you know this name because this is the person that invented the mathematics necessary for a rocket to actually leave this planet, to leave the gravitational field of Earth and actually reach orbit and go into space. So Tsiolkovsky actually met Fedorov as a kid and kind of came to this library where Fedorov worked, and they had many conversations. But then he kind of developed his mathematical theories, but also a kind of a philosophy, let's say. He was extremely prolific. Unlike Fedorov, he didn't mind publishing. He published more than 500 books, yeah? Anything from like science fiction to science, mathematics, but also all sorts of kind of personal philosophy. And some of them are kind of totally delirious, some of them are unbelievably like enlightened and profound. But he personally did not, for him immortality was not, he had a very kind of unusual idea that when we die, actually, the molecules, the atoms that make up our body, that death is actually a very happy event, yeah, that all of these particles that were locked in a human form are suddenly liberated, yeah, and they're incredibly joyous, yeah, that finally they're euphoric because they can travel in space without being bound in this kind of object which organized them before and contained them before. So even though, you know, both of them are so central to Cosmism as a field of thought, in fact, they actually kind of contradict each other on one of the central issues, which is immortality, which is at the very center of what is Cosmism, which led to a lot of, or some academics to sort of deny that Cosmism actually exists as a valid sort of, as a valid field, that you cannot, that all of these thinkers and artists and scientists that are usually grouped under this name are too different from each other to be contained within some kind of one intellectual movement. I actually, personally, I disagree. I think that there is something that they share in common, which is radically different from other kind of schools of thoughts, and there is much more in common than there is of a difference between them. But so nevertheless, what happens with Cosmism is, even though like Fedorov is such a modest person, he attracts interest of two very important figures of that period, which is two writers, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Both of them somehow come in contact with his ideas, yeah, and they actually contact him. So there is a kind of a correspondence between Fedorov and Dostoevsky, where Dostoevsky wants to know if Fedorov really means like literal resurrection, literal immortality, if it's a metaphor, or does he mean it like completely literally? Yeah, and Fedorov says yes, and Dostoevsky was apparently very happy with this answer because he also kind of believed in like literal, physical, material immortality and resurrection. And Tolstoy, they had a little bit more of a relationship. Tolstoy, for quite a few years, he was visiting Fedorov in the library on a regular basis, like once a month or something like that. And they had like kind of very, very extended conversations. In the end, they had a fight and stopped talking to each other after a kind of an incident. There was a very big famine in Russia at the end of the 19th century, and Tolstoy felt that the government was not doing enough to help the victims of this famine. So he wrote a kind of a very critical article in a British newspaper, sort of criticizing the royal family, the Tsar, and and for Fedorov, this was like, he suspected that maybe that Tolstoy did it like kind of to gain notoriety, yeah, to not because he really felt compassion towards the victims of this hunger, but because that put him in a position where he would be discussed as a very kind of like Ai Weiwei of 19th century, let's say, yeah. So after that kind of situation, they kind of stopped talking to each other. But then basically what happens is the revolution, yeah? And this changes everything in terms of Cosmism, because suddenly something that starts as a kind of a religiously based philosophy that actually is completely materialistic at its center, yeah? Because of this insistence on physical immortality, physical resurrection, technological travel in space and all of that. It's very much of a kind of a materialist philosophy, yeah? And I think it was kind of very, there was a lot of parallels in a way with Marxism, because basically in order to reach this kind of, this technology that would enable this resurrection and immortality, which is a kind of like a miraculous project that only God can do, right? Human society was to be totally transformed and totally reorganized. And the ways in which it was supposed to be, or envisioned to be transformed and reorganized, actually is quite similar to what is described in socialism and communism, let's say, right? There would be no more private property, there would be no more sort of capitalist economy, primarily because it's too inefficient, yeah? Because to generate resources great enough to enable such a fantastic, task, you would need to actually share all of the resources and direct them and sort of organize them in a way that's much more efficient than let's say, private enterprise or market kind of forces allow, yeah? So, but also, so there would be no private property, no money, not that kind of economy. There would be no luxury. Fedorov was extremely critical of production of luxury, yeah, because he felt it's just incredible waste of resources. Everything should be directed at, prolongation of life, prevention of death, development of new technologies in medicine and in science, yeah. Why squander it on like fancy furniture, yeah? So there's a very beautiful essay that he writes about that very famous World Fair that took place in Paris, that is also reviewed by Baudelaire, for example, from a very, very different perspective, where he basically it's kind of like a really interesting critique of capitalism, on the basis of like how trivial the results of this industrial production are, in fact, yeah. And so a lot of like his thinking actually parallel certain ideas that were implicit in socialism and in Marxism, and it also kind of posits as a kind of a utopian future where immortality, resurrection will be reached, human society is completely reorganized in order to reach that, but also in the conditions of immortality, probably our social relations will be very, very different, yeah? We actually improve our bodies in such a way that we could exist without oxygen, we could become like self-feeding, like certain kinds of algae that derive like energy directly from sunlight without, the need to kill living beings in order to generate energy for existence. So, it in a way, like it's the kind of vision that he comes up with is actually, and it's a non-hierarchical society, everybody is kind of equal, it's organized in his mind, it's very much modeled on the kind of relationship that exists between the members of the divine family. I'm not a Christian myself, yeah, so for me, like the notion of the Christian God has always been very peculiar because it's the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. It's like three persons, but somehow three of them are actually one God, yeah, and all of them are capable of kind of independent action, yeah, like Jesus can act without the Father, and the Holy Ghost can like manifest when Jesus and the Father are not present, but somehow they never disagree, yeah. There is no like conflict between the members of the divine family, and they don't disagree because they love each other so much that disagreement is impossible by definition. So it's a kind of a unity that is really based on affection and love, yeah? So for him, like that would be the model to be extended and scaled on a vast scale of all of the humanity, yeah? This is the kind of relationships that he envisions within this kind of cosmic society of immortal humans, yeah? And also, like, sexual reproduction would end, yeah? Sexual relations would end. The ideal was actually to overcome the difference between the sexes and for humanity to kind of become kind of androgynous, where there are no more women, there are no more men. There is no need to procreate because it's possible to resurrect. So the kind of growth of population will not come from production of babies and sexual reproduction, but from the resurrection of ancestors, yeah? And actually, like, interestingly enough, after the revolution, the Soviet government kind of flirted with support of Cosmism, like, or certain specific figures that, because basically what happens after the revolution, there is a kind of a second generation of Cosmism, which is not so religiously based at this point. It's much more comes out of anarchism, actually, Ukrainian anarchism, but also futurist poetry, yeah? And there are certain kind of groups that are formed in Moscow and in St. Petersburg that basically take ideas of Fedorov, but take it in less of a Christian direction and more in kind of a anarchist direction, yeah? And they totally like kind of reject Fedorov in writing. They say that, oh, he's just old-fashioned, like religious fart, you know? But actually they propose exactly the same thing. And they go so far as to form a political party in Moscow, and actually a couple of their deputies are elected within the Soviet, which is basically the parliament of the Soviet Union. And they make a motion to amend the constitution of the Soviet Union to introduce a new paragraph which basically a demand that gives a universal right to immortality, yeah, a universal right for rejuvenation, and a universal right to travel in space, yeah. So they did not succeed. They didn't have enough votes to actually introduce this or get it ratified for it to enter the constitution. But it's quite interesting that the political effort to do that actually took place. And, you know, one of these groups was actually kind of funded by the Soviet government. I'm still trying to figure out why. I think it may have had a lot to do with, like, kind of very complex politics of post-revolutionary period, where certain activities, even though they kind of differed from mainstream Marxism, were encouraged as a way to maybe put pressure on other kind of political parties, or to put pressure, let's say, in Christian church and Orthodox church. So alternative religions were supported in order to actually suppress kind of the more traditional religious body that existed, yeah? So the same people that organized this kind of political party at a certain point, they start a new church, yeah, and they get funding from the Ministry of Culture and the building, which is in fact a church, and they call it a Church of Liberated Labor, yeah, of Free Labor, yeah? And basically it's a kind of like a cosmist, anarchist, futurist church. It had a congregation of several hundred people, mostly artists and scientists, and they completely like rewrote the liturgy. So instead of kind of typical Christian liturgy, what they had was kind of like what we're doing here. They had lectures, yeah, kind of discussions, all sorts of workshops about science, particularly about biology and like anything about like kind of genetics and body longevity, things like that. And they published quite a lot. They had access to kind of very prominent newspapers, like some of the key newspapers that circulated in millions in the Soviet Union, where they were able to publish their manifestos and, you know, essays and things like that. So they actually had quite a bit of visibility, yeah? But also simultaneously, this has a profound effect on art, yeah, because for many reasons. For one thing, of course, a lot of these ideas were quite appealing to a kind of a more radical generation of artists at the end of the Russian Empire, and then of course after the revolution. And in fact, like, it's actually quite difficult to find a significant sort of cultural figure from that period within the avant-garde circle who was not affected by Cosmism, who did not in some way reflected some of these ideas. You know, starting with Malevich, you know, it's not an accident that the first futurist opera was called Victory Over the Sun. You know, it's quite a kind of a cosmic scenario, and actually what happens in this opera, the story is that the sun is taken prisoner, yeah, and as a kind of symbol or a gesture of kind of victory over nature and a desire to kind of to maybe overcome nature with yeah, kind of technological scientific things. For example, electric light. Yeah, but do you really need the sun when you're actually capable of producing light, you know, with electricity? But also, like the reason to overcome nature is, of course, in its relationship to death. Yeah, because actually, what kills us is nature inside of us. Yeah, so this kind of this desire to transform nature into something that does not result in our death. Yeah. Is kind of at the center of that opera, but in quite a lot of other production. And of course, if you think about, you know, suprematism and all of these floating shapes, and like even the black square, you know, like one thing, it's so kind of obvious if you look at the painting, you know, it doesn't have up and down, there is no gravity in it, you know. But somehow in art historical analysis of this work, which is really one of maybe the most important works within the sort of the corpus of modernity, there is no reference to something that's visually apparent. Yeah, so you can talk about just about anybody, Lisitsky, but also in cinema, Eisenstein, or in theater, you know, in all of these fields, all of these people were quite aware and quite affected by the ideas that basically kind of come from further up, but then get developed in many different directions. But I think I just gave like a half an hour answer to
no, but it's great.
one question. And you probably have more questions. So
no, it's great. It's great. No, it's really great.
Yeah.
Yes, I think. Well, what this half an hour answer is actually give people quite vivid images of what these 3 chapters of the film is about. The first episode it's actually about the foundation thought of Cosmism, and the second chapter is about cosmology and the politics. And you didn't elaborate with the third chapter, which is actually I'm more curious, is that you actually in the third chapter you focus on like a museum as the site for resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate more?
Yeah, absolutely. For Fedorov, like he writes in a very, very interesting way. He was kind of fascinated with museums because he kind of felt, for a number of reasons. One is he felt that museum is a kind of unique institution in our society that is not kind of directed towards production of progress. And for him, progress was like destruction of the present and the past by the future, yeah? So like if you think about like Benjamin, for example, and this very, very beautiful passage he has about the angel of history, you know? And so when angel of history looks behind him or her, yeah? What it sees is like just genocide, destruction, death, obliteration caused by time. That basically in the end everything fails, all of the empires collapse, buildings collapse, people die, plants die, everything dies. And so if you were able to perceive history, you know, in one glance, all you would see is like utter destruction, yeah? Which is a horrifying, so the angel of history is actually terrified, yeah, of what he sees behind, yeah? So what Fedorov kind of felt is that what is really essential is somehow to find a way to like to see this history maybe not as a pile of destruction, but as a kind of a field of potential, yeah? That if death can be overcome, and if the dead can be resurrected and the past can be brought back, yeah, then nothing has failed. You know, all of the projects can be continued, all of the stories can be resumed, you know. So this kind of total devastation is not really, it's just an illusion, yeah? And he felt that the museum is really, really like the key institution within that kind of project, yeah, of bringing back the past, because it already kind of does it, yeah? It has techniques for conservation, it has quite advanced techniques for preservation, restoration, yeah? And he felt that basically this is like incredibly important and a move in the right direction, except that it needs to be radicalized, so that instead of preserving some kind of artifacts or portraits of ancestors, what you actually need to do is go a step further and preserve life and bring them back to life, not only their portrait, but actually the person itself, not only a sculpture of something, not only stuffed taxidermic animals, but like bring them back to life. So this is, he felt that the role of the museum, every museum, like art museum, but also museum of history, you know, a museum as a kind of a form, yeah, could be production of life, yeah, preservation and production of life. So he felt that like this resurrection that he theorized, yeah, the man-made technological human resurrection, would actually take place in a museum. He saw, you know, resurrection as something that's deeply connected to memory, because to bring something back, you also at least need to somehow remember it, yeah, and it's impossible to remember something in the conditions of, let's say, like the commercial progress, yeah, because that is all about kind of obliteration and forgetting, yeah, like how many people here like remember very well like VHS tapes, yeah, you know, it's just this constant, relentless like erasure, yeah. So he felt that the museums are incredibly, incredibly important in the way that it's the only place in our world where we, you know, we don't throw out, you know, like old paintings or broken sculptures. No, museums are full of broken sculptures. Yeah, and he thought that there is like a significance to this greater than what we acknowledge. Yeah, yeah. So that's.
I think it's because while you were talking, it just reminded me. But we are sorry that we couldn't be able to show the film, but I remember the first time I saw the first episode was in 2014 that we were doing Shanghai Biennial, and I will be very honest. I have no idea what that work is about at that time. But now thinking back, I think it's not just for the first part, also the second trilogy that you were using a lot of technology that's like in NASA, they were using this strong red lights, like for astronauts. So this is also part of the resurrection that's using technology to be able to, it's not just existing in theory, but it's a modern technology actually support this idea, right?
Well, yeah, I think that maybe a good way to talk about this is like one of the ways maybe what attracts me to cosmism so much is like it's very different from other philosophy or other types of philosophies, because it's not about contemplation, it's about like active intervention and like a desire to transform the world by any means possible, yeah, by means of science, technology, but also art, yeah. And of course, for me as an artist, it's kind of really interesting, important, but also very moving that there is like a whole school of thought that really prioritizes, you know, this kind of, and believes in the possibility of transformation through many means, but transformation through art, yeah. And so a lot of, you know, like Fedor's writing, but almost all of people that were quite active in this movement, it's interesting, they put a lot of emphasis on like medicine, because maybe if you think about immortality, or one of the practical ways in which you could actually fight death is by curing diseases or, yeah, helping people who are sick. But the other kind of very important avenue was like this, there's this constant referral to art, because actually Fedorov felt that art is on par with you know, science and technology in terms of being kind of a potentially this technology of resurrection and technology of immortality, that there is something in art, in an artistic process, in a work of art that is inherently like connected to this very kind of elusive, very complicated goal. Yeah, so he actually writes quite a lot about art, and his ideas about art were maybe a little bit different than what the conventional understanding of what is an art object or what is artistic practice, yeah? Because for him, like, basically the ultimate work of art is resurrection, yeah? Is the capacity to bring something to life. And I think he was not like a very kind of academic thinker, I mean, not at all, yeah? So I think the way he maybe developed his ideas was in a very kind of direct way. I know that the library that he worked at is right next to the Museum of Zoology, which is actually the oldest museum in Russia. It was started in like 1790 something, but actually by a German businessman who, like a trader who had a house in Moscow and started this collection of stuffed animals that was very, very interested in science, in botany and zoology, and basically his collection of all of the samples eventually became this Museum of Zoology. And if you go there, like it's really amazing because some of the stuffed animals are 250 years old and they're still like in a rampant position, like about to attack you. But I think like basically like maybe like Fedorov kind of went there because it's a 5-minute walk from the library, and probably most like well-educated people or intellectuals of the time frequented that and a few other museums in Moscow. And you know that there is something that's already like it's quite clear that like these animals actually seem quite lifelike. Like they almost suggest that you know the next step is actually to make them life, yeah, because they look like they're about to leap out of their vitrine or something like that. And also something quite similar maybe with works of art, with paintings and sculptures, you know, because there is some kind of a capacity for an inanimate object to project emotions, yeah, to project some kind of almost like a vitalist force, vitalist kind of energy, even though it's just a canvas with some oil paint or a stone, yeah, but it can kind of affect you and move you. So it's almost like animistic, yeah, in a sense, what happens. So I again, this is like completely personal opinion. I don't know if any Fedorov scholar will, I mean, they may think that I'm saying something completely preposterous, but I suspect just from knowing his writing and how he thinks, how he thought, that it was kind of like a very intuitive, very direct kind of leap from seeing the effect of art on people and then kind of maybe thinking that if you radicalize that, if you scale it, yeah, that actually like maybe this is actually the technology of immortality, yeah. But about the red light, you know, there is so much urgency in the writing of Cosmos because, you know, death is something that's so, in a certain sense, it's quite pressing, you know, because everybody in this room will die, yeah? I mean, it's kind of amazing, you know, like we kind of go about our daily life, but actually we're kind of dying, yeah, slowly, yeah? So there is quite a lot of urgency to this project, let's say. So when I was, you know, working on these films, you know, I kind of suddenly realized that it would be totally like total contradiction and maybe betrayal of the ethos of Cosmos to just make like some kind of a representation of these ideas or like some kind of a documentary that in a way like the films had to embody the central desire to heal, cure, improve health for long life by any means possible. And in film, you know, basically film is just like light and sound, really. But light and sound actually has therapeutic applications, yeah, and it's kind of a very long history of different cultures using, you know, light as a means of therapy for various ailments, but also sounds and also color. So one of the more contemporary techniques for that was developed by NASA, by the American Space Program, where they basically, there was a problem with like duration stays on space station, where skin for some reason or cuts heal extremely slowly in a condition of zero gravity, yeah? So if you get a paper cut, it keeps bleeding for like weeks, yeah? So they needed to do something because that's actually kind of a bit of a dangerous thing on the space station. And I don't know exactly how, but they stumbled on a really remarkable effect that a certain kind of red light has on the speed of healing of skin tissue, yeah? So basically in a certain frequency range, which is 670 hertz, that kind of red light expedites healing of wounds. And so they started using it, in space station, but then it was quite quickly adopted by cosmetics industry. So there are a lot of places that do like kind of rejuvenation of skin, facial skin, using that same kind of method. But also like military media, because they're very fast. They adopted it for like special force soldiers that get wounded and then they need to be patched up very quickly. So they use light to kind of heal them, to send them back to battle really, really fast. But you could kind of do it, basically it needs to be LED light, but most projectors actually have a LED light bulb. So I kind of just thought that maybe it's an interesting idea to try to include this in the film, so as you watch it, and maybe you like it, maybe you're totally bored by it. It doesn't matter what you think about it, but it still has kind of immediate effect on your body. It still can have like this kind of immediate sort of, it improves your health or some kind of prophylactic treatment, so...
Can I just add on that?
Sure, yeah.
Because when I saw it in Berlin last year, I also thought that the red light could be, that the red light could be a metaphor for the most favorite color of the communist Soviet Russia. So
it was kind of a lucky coincidence.
Oh, it's coincidence.
But for Soviet or Chinese red flag, that's supposed to represent the blood of the proletariat, and but of course there's a connection to blood as well, because one of the key cosmists was a really fascinating figure. He's actually probably the best known of all of them. His name is Alexander Bogdanov. He's very well known by like British Marxists because he was a very close sort of collaborator and at a certain point a friend of Lenin, and was one of the founders of the Bolshevik Party, which took power and all of that. And he was a philosopher by education. He was actually a doctor, a psychiatrist, so he had medical training, and but also he was just a person of very many talents. He wrote science fiction. He wrote one of the most popular kind of Russian language science fiction novel of 20th century, which is called The Red Star, which is basically kind of about a socialist society on Mars that kind of they kidnap a person from Earth and bring him to Mars, and so he gets a chance to see what the real socialist society is like. And the book is very beautiful because it actually contains description of what their museums are like, what their factories are like, what their houses are like. And they, by the way, they also are extremely, Martians at this point, they have a very, very long lifespan. They've managed to, they're not totally immortal. You can kill them, because he killed somebody in the novel, the Earth guy. But if you kind of don't attack them, they live very, very, very long. But then at the end of the book, you realize that actually these Martians, they're sinister because they plan to colonize Earth. So even though they're kind of socialist and they've reached this very advanced kind of, that there is still this, and because Mars is a little bit overpopulated, so they want to invade our planet. So, but the book is, I really recommend reading it. It's totally incredible. It's just really strange that it was written, I think, in 1906, but it's so very far ahead of its time in terms of certain things. But basically, Bogdanov, so in addition to doing all of this, and in 1926, he started an institute for blood transfusion in Moscow, which was a kind of experimental facility to see if it's possible to develop methodology for rejuvenation doing blood transfusions between young people and old people, so basically he had a group of students that were working with him on this, and they were exchanging blood, and from other sources it seems that the method actually worked for a while, because he was balding at a certain point, and then as a result of these blood transfusions his hair started growing in his head, so there were certain kind of very clear signs of rejuvenation. Unfortunately, he accidentally kind of infected himself by exchanging blood with a student who had, I think it was malaria, I'm not 100% sure. So he died, the student actually recovered. And it's a little bit like, there is some like mythology around this as well, that there is some, I've heard some opinions that like he actually kind of felt that he would help the student by giving her his blood, but then he actually took the risk of actually dying himself to help her overcome her illness. Yeah. So it's not, but I cannot say with certainty that that was his intention. But he basically also set up the first blood bank in the world. Like the idea of blood bank comes from him, and his approach to this was that basically every citizen of the Soviet Union would have a right to these blood transfusions. Everybody would have a right to rejuvenate themselves, and this would be kind of a resource. Like every city in the Soviet Union would have this kind of blood bank, and you would go there on a regular basis and get this blood that would make you, that would slow down your aging, yeah? And so that was basically his goal. I don't know if you've been, there is a story that's been in the news this past year or so that Peter Thiel, who is this kind of, let's say, oligarch in California, yeah, the techno oligarch, he is actually doing this. He is going to a kind of a private clinic in Los Angeles that offers transfusion of plasma of blood of teenagers, yeah, and it's a little bit expensive. It's like, I think it's something between $5,000 and $6,000 per treatment, and you need to do it like quite a few times for it to have effect, and it's still not totally scientifically proven, but you know, he thinks that it's working for him, yeah, but this is like a very different vision, a very different model, you know. So what Bogdanov wanted was kind of rejuvenation for all, for the whole country, totally free, no charge, you know, for all of the citizens. And when it actually, like, somebody offers this as a service, as a commercial service in the States, it becomes something that, you know, only billionaires can do, and you know. So they're at kind of very, very different positions there.
I'd like to pick up the idea from Hu Fang that it's throughout previous days we were also discussing this idea of Russian Cosmism, and particularly how did my fall into the Asian context. I was wondering, we will not be able to continue that discussion, but I was wondering what would be your takes on this.
It would be quite complicated.
I have to make one comment about Hu Fang.
I really would love to listen.
Because like when I started working on this, I immediately wrote to Hu Fang about this cosmos, because I didn't know anything about it until about 6 years ago, and I kind of came across it very accidentally, yeah. Because, I forgot to say this. So there was a kind of proliferation of activity and writing and art in this direction all throughout 1920s. And then basically when Stalin consolidates power, he immediately makes it illegal, represses all of its practitioners. Most of them end up in labor camps or prisons. Quite a few of them are like executed by a firing squad, like basically becomes super dangerous, impossible to speak about this openly. All of the manuscripts and, you know, everything disappears. Some of it gets destroyed, some of it survives, you know, in some kind of basements and things like that, archives, you know. But basically after 1931, the entire field vanishes until quite late, until basically late 60s is when it slowly starts reappearing, and you already kind of feel a little bit of these ideas, for example, in films of Tarkovsky. Like he even uses some sentences that are clearly like derived directly from Fedorov's writing, so I think he was quite aware of it. And in certain scientific circles in the Soviet Union, suddenly it starts coming back. But really, even until now, there is very, very little awareness of it. And even in Russia, actually, very few people know about it. So I didn't know, growing up there, I never heard anything about Fedorov, about cosmos, nothing. It totally didn't exist on my kind of cultural map of Russian or Soviet culture. And yeah, so but when I found out about it, I immediately wrote to Hu Fang for a number of reasons. For one is I think that there was some of these ideas, at least in the 19th century, were a little bit influenced maybe by actually Chinese philosophy, which there were very apparently the biggest collection of like Taoist manuscripts outside of China at the time were actually in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and it was quite important and popular, and maybe let's say even fashionable for a lot of Russian intellectuals of that period. They were quite familiar with a lot of these ideas, and of course this kind of chi, like this kind of invisible energy that's, there is something, some kind of sensibility that reminded me immediately of certain kind of elements of, let's say, Chinese philosophy. And the idea was that we would collaborate, because we collaborated before with Hu Fang on a film that was made in Taiwan some years ago, where Hu Fang wrote kind of very, very beautiful text for it that was used in the film. So it was quite interesting for me to invite him to do it again. And he wrote an incredible text, which is a series of letters, which is called Dear Navigator, but it was really like a kind of a very big work, which could not really be included in the film because it was like huge and a work in its own right, yeah. But so somehow we kind of discussed this project since even before I kind of decided to try to make films. You know, he was actually one of the first people that I talked to about this. Yeah.
I mean, I think I was always tell Anton that I could not fully understand what I think you can really feel urgent. But meantime, I think it's also you feel that it's not.
Okay, so it's not about this kind of academic research or the knowledge. Actually, somehow I'm a little bit convinced that this is the common task of human being after 4 years maybe. So, but when Anton led to me that to somehow to introduce this idea or maybe the discovery, actually, I think I was immediately thinking about some kind of like a Taoism, like this kind of practices on the kind of long bit of life, but I think in the Chinese context, actually, is clearly about how you accept the nature and integrate the nature, where that there is this very beauty of kind of generosity of how that can be accepted as a part of the process, and so I never thought about this actually related to this kind of possibilities of a biotechnological approach, where that you can really turn into kind of action of rescuing this kind of fragility of human. So so in a way, I think it's interesting, dialogue even based on a very different understanding. But it's interesting, like it's kind of arrived in a kind of certain common ground because we are human on the planet. So so this probably is kind of affection also for me, to think about how this artistic approach actually, gives a kind of real challenge of how that turn into kind of maybe certain practices to try to access this kind of incredible question that how we're going to live with. But I think it's still maybe it's interesting for me to ask maybe to listen what Anton is saying, because it's always fascinating about every time that when I listen. So I think there is always something that it's beyond its fact. So always I feel like I'm listening kind of fictional story, but actually I think it's very much real. But then I think maybe I think it's still interesting, like to think about that your kind of certain life encounter with the cosmism, not as a theory, but as a kind of discovery of life journey, where that you mentioned that actually how you kind of start to encounter with this the cosmism and through Boris scores, and
yes.
then yeah, that's always fascinating for me, because it's kind of quite unbelievable with this process.
Well, it's basically what I was saying earlier, that there was there absolutely no kind of awareness or any publications, or nobody was doing any work on this topic for a very, very long time. It was kind of aborted, cut short, but interestingly enough, Boris Groys was aware of it for quite a long time. And about 10 years ago, he mentioned it to me. I was in Berlin, and I think we were just, having lunch together or something. And he started telling me this kind of very strange things that, after the revolution in Moscow, there was some kind of institute for blood transfusions, and sometimes they had parties, and they drank cocktails with human blood. And then, that Malevich was making designs for, orbiting cemeteries where bodies of the dead would be preserved at the conditions of zero gravity for future resurrection, and so forth. And and I thought, it sounds like a science fiction. It's wonderful, but it can't really be real. And he said that he published a book about this in German, but I don't speak German, so I actually did not pursue it and somehow put it out of my mind. And then about 5 years later, I was asked to interview Ilya Kabakov, who is a very well-known Russian artist who lives actually outside of New York. He's lived outside of in New York for maybe 20 years now, but he never learned to speak English. So he's actually kind of very isolated now. He lives in the countryside, and most of the interviews that have been done with him have always been through a translator, which of course makes it a little bit there's a lot of distance. So this museum in Europe asked me if I would go to his studio and talk to him in Russian, and so I went, because I always quite admired his work, and it was, so maybe because there are not so many Russian-speaking visitors in his life, he kind of just took me to the kitchen, and then he talked for 8 hours. Yeah, it was amazing. He told me everything from his birth to whatever, that moment in the kitchen, yeah. Including he basically mentioned the same things that Boris mentioned before. And then I realized, okay, if two people actually say this, maybe it's not some kind of a macabre kind of fantasy or science fiction, but maybe this is based on some actual historical material. And then I started, a little bit of research, and came across the only book of Fedorov that I could find at that point, which is called The Common Task, which is basically the name given to his philosophy. His philosophy is not called Cosmism. Russian Cosmism is a term that was kind of coined quite late, in 1972. There is a mention, it's the first usage of these two words together, and it's in the Soviet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's just one passage actually on Fedorov, encyclopedia style, and it mentions Russian cosmism. But actually this is, Fedorov never said cosmism and never would say Russian. Yeah, his philosophy, again, he also didn't claim it. It was kind of his students, his kind of, let's say, followers. The book was published posthumously in Kazakhstan, yeah, because as I mentioned in the beginning, he didn't really publish during his lifetime. So I think about 6 months after his death, two of his students published 500 copies of collected essays of Fedorov under the title Common Task. Interestingly enough, there is an inscription in this first edition that the book is not for sale, yeah, which was also very much in keeping with his kind of ethical approach to things. Like he felt that the knowledge should be available for free, that it should not be kind of sold, or the profit should not be extracted from it, not because it's like something is shameful about it, but it's just like wrong because that diverts resources from the project of immortality. Yeah? And it's interesting that it actually is published in Kazakhstan, not in Moscow, not in St. Petersburg. Yeah, so actually, I think it may have something to do with the fact that he spent some time there, or 7 months, in I think 1870s or 1880s, and I believe he was there because one of his kind of ideas was that this project of universal resurrection needs to start with the excavation of the remains of the body of Adam. Yeah. In 19th century, a lot of intellectuals believed that, or Christian intellectuals believed that the Garden of Paradise was located somewhere it's like kind of border between China and Kazakhstan at the foothills of the Himalaya mountains. Yeah, that in the Bible there is a description of the Garden of Paradise, and a location is described as being intersection of 4 rivers, and apparently there is only one place on earth where 4 rivers intersect, which is somewhere in that area. So there were a lot of kind of travelers, people that kind of went there in search of Adam is buried just outside of the Garden of Eden, outside of the Garden of Paradise. So Fedorov felt that like there needs to be somebody needs to organize actually like a military expedition jointly by British and Russian army, but not in order to like fight somebody or colonize, just to use like military organizational skills and technology to locate the grave of Adam and then bring his remains to Moscow, to the Kremlin, and in the Kremlin, like he would be the first person to be resurrected. Yeah, so and that would be the beginning of the complete transformation of the world. Yeah, so I suspect maybe he was in Kazakhstan kind of looking for the body of Adam, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. But I also wanted to say that, this may not be the first sort of discussion or conversation about cosmism in Hong Kong, because it has an interesting kind of connection to China, because after the revolution, there was a kind of a very large Russian community in the north of China, in a city called Harbin. And a lot of people that immigrated to Harbin went there because maybe they were in danger, because they didn't agree with the sort of mainstream sort of Marxist philosophy, including some of the cosmist writers. And there were some books published in Harbin in 1920s, and actually one of them was then translated to Japanese and was published in Tokyo in 1943. So there is a kind of a circulation of these ideas very, very early on in this region, way before they're translated to English or German or French, which happens like in the 60s and 70s, yeah. But there was already some kind of readership and publishing activity in China and in Japan, and I wouldn't be totally surprised if somebody actually also visited Hong Kong from Harbin, or so we don't know if this was the first ever event. Maybe there was something in the 1930s.
So I think like from the first maybe conversation about like before the first chapter of the movie, or even that time actually there is not any like plan saying that you're going to make a trilogy of the film. So like from beginning actually, that you were also sending a kind of paragraph to me, and I think this actually is more than the kind of theory or maybe kind of theory theoretical, philosophical understanding of Nicholas Philosopher or this entire intellectual, but more like from this kind of very touching moments, because actually the paragraph somehow is kind of a preparation for the film, but meantime it's beautiful writing that you that actually were telling a kind of a story that you were saying that I want to tell you something. My mother was born in the same town as the man who flew into the space from his apartment. Mm-hmm. Her father was a painter and a fighter pilot. He was killed in battle in China when he was very young. This film is dedicated to him. So the footage you are going to see was shot around the Volga River. I like everything about this place, even though I have never seen here and know nothing about this area. So I think actually for me is very much about this overlapping of the kind of the this moment that how that trying to figure out that this very strange forking path of life, and so I think this actually turns into a very complex issue about I think we're not trying to comparatively to try to compare these different life philosophy, but I think there is this very beautiful struggling for life. Actually is not for yourself, actually is for others. So eventually I think this becomes kind of maybe is more about the common ground that I'm trying to maybe respond from.
Well, the reason I wrote this, or the way I wrote this text, was just a result of total panic, because basically what happened was we were doing research with a kind of a research assistant from Ukraine, and then she had background in theater, and because she had background in theater, I agreed to participate in a kind of a big event in Berlin, which was called Former West. I think Cosmin is probably familiar with it. And so basically I agreed to stage a short play, like a 20-minute play, and we were supposed to basically, and I thought that she would write, she said that she would write a kind of a script for this play. And then I was waiting, and then we were supposed to already go to Berlin and stage it, and there's nothing coming, so at the very last moment I just got but I remember it was a very weird experience. I was at home on the couch with my computer, and then I was really angry at her for not doing what she said she was going to do, and I just kind of started writing, but without any intention to write the thing. It just the fingers started moving on the keyboard, and it was really peculiar, because there were sentences in my head. I cannot really say that I was the author of the sentences. I was just writing them down because they were completely formed, and I wrote the whole thing in maybe 1 hour, about 20 pages, which was the central script of the first film. But to this day, I don't really feel like I wrote it, because it was almost somehow dictated to me. Okay, I'm not saying that I heard a voice, but it's a very strange sensation, because this is maybe something quite important, because you are a writer, and I'm not, So for me, the only way to write was through this very kind of strange, trance-like, or panic-like, or some kind of nervous, almost breakdown, that somehow it was almost like automatic writing, where you can actually write a little bit more deliberately, maybe.
Maybe. But I find that this is a very important attention, and also I think if we that's actually I would like to ask. I think there is a quite lot of mysterious moments. Mysterious. Maybe it's not constructed, like deliberate, but it's come into the film. This is something I think like maybe it's interesting to like to think about, like why movie image, that how, because and also like how to work with this philosophical idea with movie image, and this is still, there is certain mysterious, I would say, but also I think maybe also it's come from this tension, because apparently the film did not try to illustrate the philosophical idea, but meantime you also you have to capture this invisible energy that is still continuing, like in our world today, but then how this part, but yeah, so this is something I think the movie image somehow kind of worked out. But meantime, I think from the beginning, even you didn't like think about how that, like whether that should be related to the movie image or not.
No, yeah, absolutely right. I didn't. So I kind of, what I did before. I mean, most people probably know efflux, right? So. And then, at the time, like I also did another really kind of complicated project, which was called United Nations Plaza, which was a kind of an experimental school in Berlin. So I'm certainly not a filmmaker and not a kind of a traditional artist by any means. I mean, I haven't really made very many films, So there was a kind of a very big question, like, because once I came across, all of this material and further up in realization how much impact it had on development of kind of modernism and like, let's say Soviet Marxism, and the space program and all of these things together, I felt like it's really important, very urgent in some way to present it to the public, to publish it, to make it public, but it wasn't really clear immediately how, what to write a book about it, or to curate an exhibition, or because there are very many different, ways in which you could kind of transmit, this kind of information, which is also kind of largely historical. And, I still don't totally know precisely how is it that I decided to make it a film, except that I thought that, I had this kind of an interesting experience with this school project with the United Nations Plaza. It was always very frustrating for me that it wasn't something that could be circulated, because it was like a year-long project in Berlin with many kind of very, very interesting situations that were very rich for people who were present in the room, But there was no way to kind of make it available to others who don't happen to be in Berlin, who don't happen to be in this room, and so we tried different things. We tried to publish transcripts, this and that, and somehow nothing really worked. Not even video documentation did any kind of justice to the kind of strange energy that transpires between people when there is a kind of a certain intensity to this kind of a situation, And but then I had a kind of a very interesting experience, just very accidentally. Like, we were doing something similar, kind of a discursive project of recreator in New York, and he had in his studio a Bolex camera, like a really beautiful old Swiss 8mm camera. So we didn't plan to make a film, but we kind of decided, okay, let's buy a lot of black and white film. It's not very expensive, and let's try to film everything for 3 days. And actually, he doesn't know how to use a camera, and I didn't know how to use a camera, but there was somebody in the audience, a Belgian photographer, that said, oh, okay, it's probably not very different from a photo camera. Let me try. And he actually never filmed anything before with a moving image. and somehow the material was so interesting, maybe because he never filmed anything before, because he kind of did not differentiate between like Lawrence Wiener and then some like somebody's food. Yeah, it was equal. Everything was equally interesting. It was kind of almost like anthropological footage, but there was something like totally mesmerizing about. So I worked like for a long time and actually made a film with it, like kind of impossible film because it's like largely all text and this black and white footage, and it's really a lot of reading for 1 hour. It's like reading a small book on screen, which is completely ridiculous. Yeah, but in a way, like whatever I think about this film, somehow it gave me the idea that it's interesting about like a film that you could combine quite complex textual narrative, yeah, or some kind of very complex narrative, and at the same time visual images and other kind of sound, and it becomes kind of a very immersive situation, and at the same time it's very, very compact because like you could really include a lot of information, yeah, in like a 30-minute experience and a 1 hour experience, yeah, like you can include the content of a book that nobody will ever actually read because very few people seem to read these days anyway, or yeah, or they read like a little bit, but they don't really read the whole work, somehow. Yeah, so in a way, like I was just thinking that maybe like there is a kind of an interesting model of how you could combine a certain kind of visual sensibility, but also with some kind of a more like textually based, like yeah, content in a kind of an experience that actually somebody could consume in full, within a kind of reasonable amount of time, yeah. So in the end I decided like to make a film, and the idea was to try to make a feature film about Russian Cosmism, but as I started working on it, I realized that as a kind of a total amateur filmmaker, I'm actually not capable of making a feature-length film for really simple technical reasons, because once you start editing, you have to watch it again and again and again and again. So if it's like 20 minutes, okay, it's possible to watch it 500 times until you really get the sequence perfect. But if it's like an hour and a half, to watch it like 500 times, like you just want to kill yourself, I don't know how they do it like in Hollywood, because it's a factory, this is how they do it, yeah, but if you don't want to become a factory, if you still want to be an artist, it's, yeah. So then I basically decided to kind of take it in steps, and rather than trying to make one feature film, to make 3 short films, and I'm still continuing with, like, we just shot the 4th film in Tokyo, which is also a continuation of the same project. It's in Japanese this time, and one of the reasons why we did it there, because that book was published in Tokyo in 1943, which is also kind of incredibly complex historically, because 43 is the year when Japan actually starts losing the war, and the situation is quite bad. Everything is rationed. You can't actually publish something because paper is rationed. Yeah, so somebody had to give permission to publish such a book from quite high up, but the content is some kind of a Russian philosopher, and Japan is actually kind of at war with the Soviet Union. So it's a very strange circumstances, which we haven't been able. We found the book. It's in the library of Tokyo University. We saw it does exist. But we still don't know how it came about, which is maybe a subject for another project, yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to open questions to the floor. If anybody has questions, want to ask either on the list or
I wanted to ask if there was any particular place for other animals in the Cosmos project. I'm interested in mentioning it.
Yeah, there is actually quite a lot of place for animals. It has a very complex kind of maybe dialectical relationship with nature in general, because like basically for Fedorov, which is the kind of the, let's say, the origin of kind of cosmist thought. On the one hand, he advocates control of nature, like total control of nature, total mastery of nature. But what he means is like control of the destructive forces of nature. Like he wanted to, basically, it was again quite a simple thing. He lived through several famines in Russia, which were results of drought, of like not enough rain. So basically, he kind of demanded that we create like artificial means to produce rain. So he wrote a letter to the Tsar asking him to make the army shoot their cannons in the clouds to produce rain, because he read that in America there was an experiment done by shooting at the clouds to make the rain come. Yeah, so he wanted basically the entire like Russian Imperial Army to actually control the climate. Yeah, he also kind of felt that, again, what I mentioned earlier, that even though genetics was not really yet discovered, but he kind of intuitively felt that death is somehow like inscribed onto us on the level of the nature of our body. Yeah, so in a way, like for him, the project of control of nature was also like to control death, to basically distance it, to kind of fight death. Yeah, but other like later generation of cosmists are quite interesting in relationship to animals and nature. Like one of my favorite kind of thinkers in this movement is his name is Valerian Muravyov, and he kind of was particularly active like around the time of revolution. He was not a Bolshevik, he was a member of a party, like a socialist party called SR, who actually were very, in Russia there were two revolutions in 1917. But, so there is some kind of ecological concern, like Fedorov basically hated exploitation, and including exploitation of nature, of this planet. Like he kind of demanded development of a new relationship to this planet, which is not based on just constant extraction of resources in order to produce, trivial things or luxury items or things that will be kind of consumed and discarded immediately. Yeah, so he wanted kind of a much more thoughtful relationship to the planet itself. Cosmin, you have a question.
Yeah, no, I'm curious if there wasn't any right-wing deviationism within Cosmism, if it didn't lead to any kind of fascist direction.
It didn't lead, well, for one thing, like it's against death, right? So like and it's against violence, and it's against militarism. Yeah. So like some of the key things that are really important for fascism. From a cosmist perspective, it's total rejection, opposition of anything like that. There are certain things like eugenics, for example, because fascists were totally into eugenics, but actually, in 19th century and all the way up until 1930s, maybe until the fact that fascists like embraced eugenics so much alerted other non-fascist scientists and intellectuals to the fact that maybe eugenics is deeply problematic. Yeah, before Hitler and before Nazi Germany, eugenics was kind of a very popular field of thought, and very many quite progressive people really championed like this idea. Most of you know what eugenics are, but so a lot of scientists and intellectuals felt that we do need to have some kind of control, like improvement of the human race, and of course like control of genetics and control of heredity and all of that. Like we actually need to pay much more attention to it, and so forth. Actually, Muravyov, the person that wanted to resurrect all of the microbes and viruses, he writes very positively about eugenics, but which immediately like alarmed me. But again, I realized that I read it through he died before Second World War started, so he kind of probably could not foresee the misuse of this, or the possible like misapplication of these ideas. In more contemporary sense, yes, it seems that a lot of, or some within like kind of right-wing nationalist kind of somewhat fascist configurations in the contemporary Russia discovered Cosmism, and they're kind of very excited about it because, well, for one thing is they like the name. They like that it's called Russian Cosmism. But yeah, so they kind of like, and then there's this further off, and they see some kind of religious motifs, and they're also very kind of pro-Orthodox Church. So, but their relationship to it is quite similar to, let's say, a good analogy would be the relationship between Nietzsche and Nazis. Yeah, that Nietzsche really, I think, if he was not kind of totally sick at the end of his life, if he was able to speak, he probably would have denounced fascism and Nazism. Yeah, but because he was incapacitated and paralyzed and unable to say anything, they actually used certain catchphrases from his writing about, you know, I don't think that Hitler was Nietzschean, and so when somebody just takes will to power as a slogan, it doesn't really mean that they understand at all the philosophical. He wrote extensively about geoengineering the planet. He wanted it to be surrounded by like electrical conduits that would control weather and channel energy. Like it's really, he has quite developed like vision of how this planet could be totally geoengineered to basically be a safe place for humans and to be like kind of a place for immortality and kind of like, let's say, paradise in a way.
I think maybe one last question from you.
I wanted to build on the transhuman question, but I really like the way you addressed it as sort of, I guess, the apolitical aspect of what's going on in California. I'm from Vancouver, just north of them, involved in scientist artist, and I created kind of an open science lab there. The influx of this sort of transhuman element is very strong. On the other hand, I'd like to think that there's something in sort of like a democratized science or science fiction or something that might relate. I'm curious what you think about this, the sort of political potential of science fiction as a sort of way of reimagining the world, of a new left or something like this. How Cosmism might fit into that and might even reply directly to this kind of California kind of individualist apolitical version.
Well, yeah, I mean that's I think one of the reasons why I'm working on this is maybe partly like to, well, for one thing, like to first of all to claim Cosmos for the left, not to allow the right to kidnap it for their sinister sort of things. But yeah, I do think science fiction actually has potentially quite a lot of power because it kind of it produces certain kind of images for certain kind of movement, because it's very difficult for for people actually to develop imaginary that necessary in order to somehow move forward, and of course fiction and particularly and science fiction and art in general has is actually quite good at precisely that, but maybe Hu Fang actually wants to say something about science fiction.
I mean, I probably not like particularly like very much into this kind of hardcore science fiction. But I think it's I think we're living in this circumstance where that maybe I think quite often like we but I think maybe it's more about the fiction. More about this, how the fiction can reveal kind of hidden truth of the living condition as well as how human emotions go. I think this is somehow it shares kind of a common, maybe kind of common path for the fiction writing, because it's never about, actually not about evolution. And I think what happened in, I think, in many of the aspects of the current circulation of information of kind of perception, actually very much about, I think it's still that it creates kind of or making the illusion of that how we live with that. So I think in a way, fiction for me is kind of very interesting practices that we see that how that could somehow, like to build up this entry into the kind of even integrated kind of life process. Basically, that you carry on this perception, and then to again that you're feeling that you're going back to the reality again with this kind of certain from the practices that you can find in this entry again.
I think, I'm sorry, I have to cover then I think this can really go on and on. Thanks, Anton, today for giving such an insightful information about the project. And I think we're all very curious to know what you will develop in the future, how art can become technology of immortality. I think for most of us working here, we'll be really curious to know. So thank you, Anton, and thank you, Hu Fang. Thank you.